Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural HBEST Virtual Roundtable Seminar Series. As you all know, unfortunately, the HBEST annual conference at Detroit this year was canceled due to the pandemic, and the council really wanted to try to make sure that sense of community maintained and that there's still a chance for us to discuss research. So over the summer, council representatives Coren Apicella, Chris Von Ruden, and student representative Carrie Pick proposed and started to organize this series of gathering a panel of experts to talk about issues and topics of interest in the evolutionary and behavioral sciences. Since then, Courtney Crosby, Paul Deutschman, and myself have been organizing the events, and we're hoping to announce more after this as well. So I just want to give a big thank you then to Corinne, Chris, and Carrie for setting this up and doing a lot of the big legwork to get this off the ground, and of course the Executive Council for enthusiastically supporting this event. Before I turn it over to our moderator and speakers, I just want to give a quick run through of Crowdcast. If you want to ask a question of the panel, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout, you can use the Ask a Question button at the bottom right screen. This will highlight it for us more so than the chat on the side of the screen to your right. You can also upvote questions that you think are particularly interesting or that you'd like to, the panel to answer. And then finally, we just ask that people keep the questions brief. You don't need to give us a paragraph or two background setting up the question. Our speakers don't need to, juggle a wall of text while also answering your questions. With that, I'd just like to introduce our moderator and speaker. So the topic today is Beyond Weird, which is accompanying a special issue in Evolution and Human Behavior that was guest edited by Joe Henrich, Norrin Zion, and Coren Apicella. And today, our moderator for the event will be one of those guest speakers, Dr. Coren Apicella. Coren is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an associate editor of Evolution and Human Behavior, and as I said, one of the council members for the society. And Coren, why don't you go ahead and introduce our speakers?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and hello to my panelists and to all of the HBES attendees. I see 110 people here, so gosh, I'm so happy that there's just such a good turnout. Really fantastic. So as you know, our discussion today will be on cross-cultural research in the evolutionary study of human behavior. And I'll just say that the society chose this to be our inaugural topic because this is something that we feel strongly about, increasing diversity in our research. And we wanted to send the message that this is something that we care about, something that we value, and also just something that we are working on. And as Chris mentioned, concurrent with this roundtable discussion, the Society's flagship journal, Evolution and Human Behavior, has released a special issue on this topic as well, with many really, really excellent contributions. Some of the authors of those contributions are panelists today, so definitely jump on the website, check that out. So today I'm joined by 4 expert panelists, all anthropologists. So we have Dorsa Amir, a postdoctoral researcher at Boston College, Clark Barrett, professor of anthropology at UCLA, Joseph Henrich, professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University, and Brooke Scelza, professor of anthropology, also at UCLA. They are really all phenomenal at what they do, which is to use an evolutionary lens in understanding human behavior. And I'll just say that each of them has taught me so much through their scholarly contributions, but also personal discussions too. So it's really an honor to have you all here today. So I thank you on behalf of the Society. I know it's a really crazy time for a lot of people, so we really appreciate you being here. I have curated a list of what I think are the most pressing questions in cross-cultural research. I will say that I recognize that some of these questions are hard. They're not meant to trick you. And we might not have good answers for them right now, but I think that they are discussions that we should be having. So I'm going to start with these questions, and then sometime during the second half, as I run low on the questions, I'll look to the question board to supplement my list. So why don't we just first start by having each of you just say hi, tell us a little bit about your research, and maybe if you don't mind sharing something personal, maybe what you've been, doing during this pandemic, maybe new hobbies you've picked up, or I know those of you who have kids, you probably dropped hobbies. So what are you looking forward to maybe after this nightmare ends. Dorsa, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I'm Dorsa Amir. I just want to first thank you for this invitation. I'm really excited about this discussion and for all the people for showing up on a busy Thursday. So my research is focused on looking at the developmental origins of preferences and decision-making across cultures. And my primary fieldwork takes place in Ecuador among the Shuar, near actually where Clark works. We've met up in the field before. During the pandemic, I basically gave up the pretense of looking cool, so now I'm just my true self. And I've picked up a few hobbies in terms of virtual tabletop gaming. So I've gotten into Dungeons and Dragons recently, which has always been something I wanted to get into. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. My character is a high elf wizard.
That's amazing. Clark?
Yeah, hi, I'm Clark. Thanks, Corinne, for organizing this, and thanks to the rest of you for being here. I'm also really looking forward to this discussion. So my work looks at cognition across people and across cultures. I've been working in indigenous communities in Ecuador for 23 years now, and also collaborating with people that work at different field sites around the world, including basically everyone here. And my work right now is looking at, it's a project called the Geography of Philosophy Project, where we look at how people think about knowledge, wisdom, and understanding around the world, including various interfaces with domains like morality and language. And in the pandemic, I have gotten really in touch with plants.
Wonderful. Okay. Joe, hi.
Hi, everyone. So I am broadly interested in the, sorry, I'm getting a lot of echo right now. Broadly interested in the evolution of culture and cultural evolution. I've worked in a lot of different areas, including cooperation, religion, status. Since the pandemic started, I've been playing a lot of Pop-A-Shot with my son Josh. We have a large Pop-A-Shot in our attic. And I guess I most miss my Friday social gatherings with my colleagues that sometimes Dorsa has attended, where we talk about science and also gossip.
Great. Brooke.
Hi, I'm Brooke Scelza. I work in Namibia, where I have been working for about 10 years now, and my work focuses mainly on reproductive conditions, thinking about parenting and partnerships of all different kinds. And I've also been involved in a couple of cross-cultural projects, Culture in the Mind, with which Clark and Joe are both involved in, and another project run through the Santa Fe Institute looking at inequality across cultures. And my pandemic life is centered mostly around educating my kindergartner and second grader, so I'm deep into elementary education more than anything else right now.
I hear you, Brooke. We're doing a lot of, iPadding mostly at home, but trying to supplement that with some other stuff. Okay, so Joe, I'm actually going to start with you here because you were, one of the authors on an influential BBS paper that came out about a decade ago now, The Weirdest People in the World, and that was the inspiration for our special issue. For those attendees who, haven't heard your backstory yet of, how you came up with this idea, do you mind sharing it?
Sure. So it just started when I moved from the Anthropology department at Emory University to the Psychology department at University of Columbia. And there I encountered Steve Hine and R. Norton Zion, and over a series of lunches, we realized that not only were we each finding substantial cultural variation in our domains of expertise, but that the population was commonly studied by psychologists were often at the extreme ends of distributions. And so that's led us to kind of a big review, putting together all the data we could find across the social sciences. And this eventually led to the Weird People paper. So it was noticing that across these different domains, the subjects commonly were at the extreme. Is there anything?
So you're getting quite a bit of feedback.
I don't know about
Yeah,
others.
if anybody has headphones would be really great right now, or maybe turn down your volume while others are
We can also
speaking.
mute our mics.
Mute your mics.
How do we?
Okay, I think we might have resolved it. Okay, thanks, Joe. Was there anything else there?
No, that covers it, I think.
Okay, so you know, that wasn't really the first time the problem of, you know, bias in psychology research had been addressed, right? There have been others before that have written about it, but there was, you know, something about this paper that stuck. It broke ground, and this is really a question for, you know, anyone on the panel. What do you think was different about this particular paper? Was it the message? Was it perhaps, you know, the timing was right? Were people just ready to hear this?
I have one point, which was there was more evidence at this point. Enough data sets had become available, so it was easier to see the pattern.
Clark, you looked like you were going to jump in there too. Was it?
I don't have any particular insight other than, I mean, I do think that the time was right in, at least in evolutionary social science, for people to receive the message. So, I mean, I also think the way that Joe and Steve and Ara wrote the thing was, there was some magic there in the writing that and the rhetorical presentation that I think was persuasive in a maybe actionable way, in a way that prior people like David Sears and Paul Rosen and others hadn't quite dug in with their message.
Mm-hmm. Well, even just the weird acronym alone was really impactful, right? It was super catchy. Do you think that it's been useful, or I've heard some pushback against it? Do you think it's been mostly useful, problematic in any way?
Are you asking me?
Oh, or anyone.
Well, I mean, it started a conversation, right? A really important conversation. And I think it was instrumental, I think, in getting people to be thinking about what the implications of talking about universality from such a narrow viewpoint were. And it's inevitably, as people then start to have those conversations, we're going to get more nuanced in the way that we think about it. And so there are going to be criticisms that come in about, is weird the right, you know, is that in and of itself too limiting or too broad or too, right? So there are going to be ways that we kind of pick it apart, but that can only happen once you get the conversation started.
Mm-hmm.
I think as a rhetorical device, it's been really successful in starting the conversation. I do think there is a tendency with simplified kind of ideas like this where people keep it simple and it can cause some issues. So we've talked about this a little bit in our paper in the special issue, and I think some of the other authors mentioned this as well, but it kind of brings up now this like weird, non-weird dichotomy, which I think can be a little bit problematic. Or, you know, there are many elements in the weird acronym, right? There's education, there's westernization, there's industrialization, and all of those are not necessarily always aligned or contributing the same to cultural change. And so I think, yeah, there's been potentially some drawbacks of it becoming so popular. Actually.
Right. Joe, do you think researchers have misconstrued it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing to remember about the acronym is that it was intended as a consciousness-raising device. So exactly how Dorsa and Brooke set it up, I think, is right. So it was to point out to researchers that the populations that they'd been studying are often psychologically unusual. So they should step back. So you label them weird. Oh, maybe I should think about whether I can generalize from this weird population. And it was also supposed to be a bit of a mirror for the researcher, because most researchers come from particular cultural backgrounds, which give them intuitions and cause them to make assumptions that don't, you know, match up with most of the environments that humans have evolved in and lived in over the course of our evolutionary history. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think the couple of the main problems have been pointed out. So sometimes people will ask me if a particular country is weird. And once you're asking that question, you're asking the wrong question, because weird was meant to be the subjects typically used by psychologists in their experiments. So you can't decompose the acronym. There's no hidden theory in the acronym. There's no kind of causal, notions in there. You could ask, inductively, what populations around the world are most different from the populations typically studied by psychologists? So the kind of cultural distance from the US or something like that, because so much of psychology is dominated by American subjects. So just in terms of sort of strategically deciding where you're going to work, if you don't have a theory to tell you, you can do that.
Right.
The other one is the one Dorsa mentioned, which is the dichotomy problem. We always emphasized in the paper, we'd always show all the variation, right? So there's lots of different variation, but there is this tendency to kind of clump. And I think it's important to push back against that.
So those are all excellent points. I've also heard, we talked about this a little bit before, Joe, but there are some anthropologists out there that have claimed that the label itself exoticizes non-weird populations. So I'm thinking of authors like Kate Clancy and others, which is something that we obviously want to avoid. What's your response to that?
Well, I would refer people who might suggest that back to the introduction to the weirdest people in the world, the paper, where we open by describing a New Guinea society. And then as we're taking the reader down the trail, look at this unusual New Guinea society, we turn around and we put the mirror on the researcher and argue that they and the populations they use are the exotic ones in a global perspective. So we did exoticize, but we exoticized weird people, which is why we
so you actually did the opposite. We did the opposite. Sort of, you pointed out all the ways in which we, once you take this bigger global view of humans, we ourselves are weird, right? Okay. So, well, I guess the follow-up question would be well, how are we doing? Are we solving this diversity problem? And I think, the attendees here would be particularly interested in, our society, our flagship journal, Evolution in Human Behavior. How are we doing compared to, other behavioral science journals? Maybe this is one's for Clark.
Yeah, I one of the papers in the special issue that this roundtable is sort of prompted by was by me, where I did a sort of bibliometric analysis of EHB. So that gives some figures for how we're doing, and I would point people to that. I think that we're doing well in some ways and not well enough in other ways. I agree with what everyone here has said about the really, really beneficial effects that the weird paper and thinking about weirdness has contributed to our research and the society in the field of evolutionary social science. But I also think that I'm not sure how unusual our discipline is in this regard, but I think evolutionary social scientists tend to be fairly self-congratulatory, and I worry that the increased attention on sort of doing cross-cultural work will lead to a sense of complacency, like that's enough. And here's a case where I think that sociocultural anthropology is just decades ahead of us in so many ways, in both thinking about diversity, non-reductionist ways of thinking about diversity across societies. Even critiques by sociocultural anthropologists of the concept of culture, which I encourage people to look at, because that too is an essentializing thing when we talk about American culture or Japanese culture. But also there's a turn right now in sociocultural anthropology that I think we should all attend to towards more inclusivity of our research communities in the research itself. Mm-hmm. And I do think that there is still in evolutionary social science a sort of unidirectional flow of theory and ideas from the researchers who are from a particular kind of educational background, and it's just imposed on the rest of the world. And sociocultural anthropologists have been at the forefront of critiquing this, including in their own work. But we do have some exceptions, and I would point to the work of Brooke in particular, which I think has been really good in that way, in her involvement of Himba communities in her own research, including at the stages of design and communication and all that stuff. So I think that things are changing. I think we can do better, but I think we need to just not become complacent.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I'm keen to ask Brooke about that a little bit later on. Are there still some groups that are just tend to be less represented than others right now? What should we be? Is there some groups of individuals that are just missing still?
Well, Clark points this out in his article on EHB, but I think another kind of polarization that's happened is sort of maybe epitomizes this weird, non-weird dichotomy is that people are either want to study a small-scale society, or they're using sort of typical university students from the US or Europe. And there's a huge gap in the middle, right? Most people live in the middle. And we can get into there. I think later we'll talk about sort of problematizing the idea of small-scale societies too. But it seems like there's a really, huge gap there in terms of what people could be, who people could be working with that are not at one of those two poles. And
yeah, no, that's an excellent point, Brooke. Do you think then that this, representativeness in research is primarily a psychology problem, or do you see this kind of polarization in anthropology as well?
Well, I mean, in anthropology in general, I think, like, as Clark was saying, right, I think there's a lot more representation of the middle if you look at where cultural anthropologists are working, right? I think within the evolutionary social sciences, it is still more polarized, though I think it's starting to change. So I'm a human behavioral ecologist by training, and I think we have sort of a slightly different issue than the kind of weird paper brought up, right? So there's the idea that you have this kind of weird, non-weird dichotomy when you're thinking about universals and how applicable it is if you do a study at UCLA to everywhere else in the world. Behavioral ecologists traditionally have worked often in small-scale societies, and I think that causes a different kind of problem in that they can essentialize what's happening in some particular contemporary foraging population and extrapolate out to what that means about our past, or about foragers in general, or something like that, right? And I think that's something that I think evolutionary social scientists of all stripes contend with and have to think about how to be more nuanced and what the caveats should be when we're trying to make those kinds of judgments. There's a nice paper that just came out this week by Abby Page and colleagues in evolutionary anthropology that talks about hunter-gatherer demography and what you can and can't take away from looking at contemporary people who are continuing to forage for at least some of their diet. So I point people to that. But so there's kind of a whole suite of different problems that are interconnected here.
I'd like to mention that, we should look to economics sometimes, because they've done a much better job of, looking much more broadly, including all of these kind of gap countries or gap populations that get missed by the kind of dynamics you guys are talking about.
I just want to jump in also and address the point of diversity among researchers. So I think the weird paper and the conversations that ensued have been hopefully starting a conversation about the people that we study. But the people doing the studying, I think, is really the next wave of correction that needs to take place. There are a lot of barriers that keep people outside of Western, researchers out of science. They're typically writing in a language, for instance, it's not their first language. I think there is, in fact, a stigma against labs or researchers coming from outside the United States or the West, especially in publishing and in grant funding. And even things like having regional conferences in the United States. Like, none of my Iranian colleagues have been able to come to the United States for a number of years. And those opportunities, I think, are really difficult to come by. But in addition to just like mere representation, which I think is important on its own, this is the point that I think Joe has raised many times, but the ideas that we're following up on and the research questions that we're asking, these are not culture free. They're not coming from like the ether. They are being developed in a culture that we reside in. And I think actually Clark does a really good job covering this in his article, but there are some focal points that are, historically have attracted a lot of attention and that dominate a lot of the papers coming out in the evolutionary social sciences. And there is, I think, some downsides to just coming from the same viewpoint and really like excluding people from other backgrounds who have different ideas and different research questions from contributing to the conversation. I think it really narrows our focus in a way that's potentially detrimental.
So our science would be better if we had more representative samples and more representative researchers working in it. That's a wonderful point, Dorsa. I'm going to follow up and a little bit more on the academic side of things. Cross-cultural research has, challenged many of our, long-held views about what is universal. So going back to, what Brooke was talking about. Yet many of you have argued that we still, there are a lot of things still missing. We don't have a complete portrait of human nature yet. Do you think, though, that perhaps maybe the most interesting differences have already been discovered? And if you don't, do you have any hunches about, what are those things that we currently think are true or currently think are universal that with a little bit more research and digging, it'll turn out that they're not? That's really for anyone. It's a tough one.
I actually think this is a really tricky question, kind of for the reasons that I was just bringing up, because you don't know what you don't know. Right, we're asking questions that are related to the types of discourse that's been happening in our cultures and in our institutions, but there's a lot of things that we don't even know are out there that are interesting and open questions. And I think this actually really highlights the importance of something Clark was mentioning, which is qualitative and ethnographic work, to just sometimes just observe and participate and try to figure out what some of those blind spots are. And I think really, and I hope this is changing in the evolutionary sciences, but I think that there's been typically some undervaluation of the importance of that type of work in helping generate questions that can contribute to our understanding of human nature.
I think the lesson from the history of science is that there are giant things we're not seeing, and that the people who come after us will laugh at our ignorance. So that's a virtual certainty. I just don't know what they're going to be laughing at. Wish I could figure that out. Right.
So really good points. I want to tie this into this comment, Dorsa, that you made during your CogSci talk that you gave, which is excellent. It's online for anyone who wants to watch it, back in June. You said, let me see if I can find it here. You said that, time was running out, that with industrialization, what we're getting is the homogenization of the decision-making environment, which can lead to homogenous behavior. With, time running out, we're up against this deadline potentially. I see, and I understand the value and, what Clark is, brought up, that maybe we need to be going out there and doing, less theory-driven research. But is this a sort of risky strategy potentially, given that, there are some questions, they might not be the best ones yet, but there are some questions that we do have that we want answers to?
Yeah, so just to kind of contextualize that point, the point that I was making in that talk was basically that with industrialization comes some homogenization of the types of decision-making environments that people are in. So typically, as you become more and more plugged into the global economy, you might be interacting with more people, you might be seeing benefits to long-term cooperation, and typically people are very sensitive to the decision-making environment that they're in, and so they're more likely to pick up the types of preferences and behaviors that are successful in those networks. And I think actually a really good analogy to this is the analogy of the transition from kind of subsistence horticulture or agriculture to monocropping, for instance. So there's a lot of ecological diversity in the way that people typically plant their gardens, for instance. In this form of bet hedging, where sometimes if one crop doesn't fail or does fail, there's another one that can take its place. But with increasing kind of global agriculture, what you get is a shift to cash crops. So now everyone's just planting coffee, and that's the main thing. And you really start to lose a lot of that diversity that was there before, and the knowledge of how to kind of maintain and upkeep that. And I think that's a good analogy in terms of behavior as well, because once you start shifting to this global structure, you might actually be losing out on some of the really interesting variations in behavior and development that you might not get a chance to really observe again. So the point I was trying to make is actually one that I've heard Clark made a lot, which is the urgency of this type of work, and in particular working with populations that are in different subsistence structures or social structures, because I really do think there is this kind of homogenization happening that's going to take away our ability to really understand the full spectrum of the way that humans have evolved and the way that humans live. And a really good example of this actually comes from a colleague of mine, Helen Davis, with some work she's done with John Stieglitz and Haley Kaplan and Mike Irvin on formal education and child development. So for instance, something that's happening in the field of child development, which I study, which is that typically in most of the Western societies that you've studied children, their development is perfectly confounded with formal education. And it's really hard to try and extricate what is it about formal education per se that might be changing some of these developmental pathways. And so they've done some really good work among the Tsimane, looking at things like nonverbal IQ testing, and finding a pretty strong effect of both education in general and education quality in shaping these types of outcomes. And those are just the type of questions, for instance, that I think we won't be able to answer
Right.
generation or two from now. And so I think it's really important to think about what we can learn about diversity now before we lose the chance to really observe it.
And to really just think about what are those questions that we really want answers to, because we ourselves are impacting the groups that we're working with, right? And so any questions that we might, ask now might in some ways come at a detriment to possible future questions that we might want to ask. So yeah, maybe we researchers should just be getting together and talking more too about what we want to know, what's really important to know.
Can I briefly
Clark.
just add a little bit to what Dorsa said? So, I mean, I agree with all that. But there's also a connection to the earlier question about like what we're missing. And I think, just something to think about is that take a look at the phenomena that you see around you in your life, and then ask yourself, how does evolutionary social science grapple with those phenomena? And I think that if you do that, you'll see a lot of what we're missing. In particular, just look at EHB, open it up, or and ask, look at the articles and say, well, how reflective is this of the lives of humans every day? This is a point that I made in my paper, and I think, you can immediately see things that we're missing, right? This is not to say that ESS doesn't theorize everyday phenomena like politics or discrimination or things like that. But there's a tendency to see those things as just sort of like token manifestations of evolved psychology. And so we kind of use, we maybe do an experimental design where we're kind of using something about politics to test theories about group psychology or something like that. What I'm saying is we're doing that instead of treating those things as phenomena in and of themselves that are evolutionary phenomena. And so we're really thinly theorizing things that are in fact incredibly rich. And there's so much stuff going on now with like nationalism, imperialism, neoliberalism, the environmental crisis, which are really, really thinly theorized in evolutionary science, but they're clearly important things. And I think we already know we need to do that, I would say, or we should know.
One, I think, takeaway in terms of moving forward is also there's been kind of this idea that we think about, is something universal or is it variable, instead of thinking about the interplay between those two things, right? There may be some aspects of behavior that you might see across many places, and yet there's also incredible variation. And how do we, instead of posing the question, is it universal or not, which is, I think, a lot of the way you see these papers traditionally framed, we should throw that idea away in many cases and be using the fact that we know there is so much variation to feed into the theory of thinking about why there might be some particular aspect of this that we see across many places, and yet how does variation feed into that, change it, push on it, and I think that'll give us a richer understanding of the kinds of phenomena that Clark's talking about.
Should we take a question from our attendees? I'm going to go to Swemi's question here. Besides the need for participants' variety, could you comment on the need for variety in methodology?
So I can talk a little bit about this. I came to the kind of psychology part of this late. I really had no formal training in evolutionary psychology at all. I came from a very strictly HBE background, and when I got to UCLA, it was the first time that I was really exposed to thinking about evolutionary psychology and cultural evolution. And that in and of itself forced me to broaden the way that I think about methods, but also kind of naturally led to me trying to integrate more traditional methods from cultural anthropology in with the kinds of work that I then started doing, which were, vignette kinds of things or replications of classic psych studies like the jealousy study. And so I often fall back a lot on those kinds of methods, using focus groups and demography and semi-structured interviews and things like that, really just like the participant observation, bread and butter of cultural anthropology, right? I feel like has been really helpful. And I think when we think about cross-cultural work, one of the other things we haven't talked about is the idea of sort of helicopter anthropology, where people kind of want to replicate a study or they want to test it in a non-weird context. And so they kind of pop into some particular place and they go and they run their experiment. And I think there's a lot of dangers to doing that for both ethical and practical research design reasons. And so I would really emphasize going back to our anthropological roots in thinking about study design and really relying on a lot of basic ethnography to try to understand the questions that we're asking in the particular place that we want to ask them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share my thoughts, which is, I really think we're at the point now where if you're an evolutionary researcher, you're kind of post-discipline, right? So you need to study communities across the life course using a full range of experimental, observational, focus groups, all those techniques. So I think the concern that Brooke raises is a big one, because you see psychology trying to deal with that, and they're trying to replicate their existing approach. And then by doing it with more people, you got to throw that away. You want to study communities over the long period, over decades, linked labs. I mean, I think we know what to do. It's just a matter of figuring out how to do it.
One of the things that I talk about in my paper in this issue is that I make a plea for slow science. I don't think all science needs to be slow, but I think that in evolutionary social science, many of us have become enamored with a big science model, big and fast. Part of that is sort of physics envy, but we also kind of want these papers in Nature that have like 20 societies in them and that measure everything under the sun and use a giant statistical model to look at all that stuff. And I do think there's room for that. I think that's great. But I think that if everybody in the field runs towards that model, it's going to have bad effects on knowledge. It will make us miss a lot of things. Hurrying up and making things bigger and faster is not necessarily the best unilateral route to knowledge. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think there has been almost like runaway selection for a number of cultural sites, which I think is really problematic, right? So why do it in 4 when you can do it in 12 cultures, right? And I think outside of anthropology in particular, there's a lot of attention and a lot of, it's valued highly, I would say, to have more and more populations. Actually, I remember when I was doing my thesis, I was doing only 4 populations. And I was told that that would never get published in a good journal because you need at least 15 now, is what I was told. Exactly. But I think that's a huge issue. Like it's catchy, it's flashy. People like maybe are like, oh, it must be more real because it's in more populations. But we actually discussed this trade-off a bit in our EHB paper, but there really is a trade-off between depth and breadth. And the more and more cultures you add, the more nuance you're missing. And the more I think potential there is to run into problems like construct validity or just misinterpretations of how the task is deployed across cultures and what the participants are thinking when they answer your questions. Like there's a lot of noise that gets added. And sometimes I think that's useful and sometimes it's not. But I think this kind of like blind acceptance and admiration for greater and greater number of sites is a little bit problematic, at least in my view.
And that's potentially sort of disciplinary specific to some extent, right? Maybe in psychology, we might value that a little bit more than in anthropology. So yeah, the fields definitely value different things to some extent. So my follow-up question, which would be for the younger crowd out there. So there are students who are interested in cross-cultural research, right? And they're currently thinking about going to grad school, choosing between anthropology departments and psychology departments, right? Apart from choosing an advisor whose research, matches their own interests, what are the things that they should be considering, right? What are the advantages of going to a psychology department versus an anthropology department? Not a trick question.
I'm sure you and I are about to say about the same thing.
I want to hear from Brooke and Dorsa.
I mean, to me, the value of, I can't speak to the value of a psychology education because I don't have one. So in some ways, my guess is that maybe there's probably some more methodological rigor in your traditional psychology training. But I mean, to me, the value of having, especially a 4-field training in anthropology, which at UCLA we still try to impart upon our students as much as we can, is that even if you wind up doing your work in a weird population, that you have an anthropological perspective feeding that work, right? So that you're doing exactly sort of what one of the points of the weird paper was, right? Is that you should exoticize this weird culture and see it for what it is. Make sure that you understand that you're looking through this particular lens of who you are as a researcher, even when you're, looking down the street. And I think anthropology is really useful in providing those kinds of tools to help you think critically about the culture that you're in and any other culture that you might work in.
What about the likelihood of getting employment, though?
That's what I was going to talk about. It really depends, I think, on what you're planning to do with the degree. I think that should be the first question to ask yourself, and where you really want to get a job. I will say, I agree with Brooke, actually. So my training is in anthropology. I kind of did truly a 50-50 anthro-psych PhD, and I'm now in the psych department. I think anthropology really gives you a broad foundation. I think it's fantastic. You really get a lot of theoretical depth and breadth. You are exposed to things that might, never occur to you, but are actually super interesting, like paleontology or comparative work or, evolutionary biology. And I think that has been a really rich foundation to draw from, and I've really appreciated having that. That being said, logistically speaking, there is significantly less funding in anthropology over psychology, and it's a smaller community. And I've really enjoyed, my time in psychology departments, and I've really learned a lot. And I think Brooke mentioned this as well, but psychology has a lot of strengths. There's a lot of people, it's well-funded, there's a lot of ideas. There are just a lot of interesting conversations taking place, a really rich history that if you come into with a different perspective, you can really start to think differently about and contribute to. And I will say psychology has done a terrific job accepting and really leading the open science movement, which I think is coming to anthropology, but perhaps a bit more slowly. And in terms of statistical methodological rigor, I really think psychology is a leading discipline in that regard. And so what I would encourage you to do if you're interested in both fields is to seek out programs that actually have strengths in both of those fields and kind of immerse yourself in those worlds and see which one fits you better, which, there are many universities out there that have really strong both anthropology and psychology departments. UCLA is a prime example of this, UBC, UC Santa Barbara, I went to Yale. And I really enjoyed being able to kind of sample both of them. I didn't want to have to choose.
I mean, for the university presidents and provosts out there listening, we should start more departments of human evolutionary biology. If we could replicate that, then we could all just be in those kinds of departments.
All right. So yeah, I guess we are becoming more interdisciplinary, and that's great. More psychologists are out there incorporating cross-cultural samples into their research, either by doing it themselves, collaborating with others, and so forth. And we're also just seeing students being exposed to cross-cultural research in psychology at a much younger, much younger stage. So I gave a talk at McMaster last week, and the students there that I spoke to told me that they were exposed to Hadza research in their Intro to Psych course, which I was sort of like blown away, like, whoa, that's crazy. So my question for all of you, because you've all had training, formal training in anthropology, is what are the lessons that, or insights from anthropology that you think any psychologist out there who is, even just reading cross-cultural research really needs to know? That they, like, what do they need to know to read about cross-cultural work, do cross-cultural work, that sort of thing? This is your chance.
I mean, a thing about anthropologists is that maybe make, so you can always see these things as glass half full, glass half empty, or there's two sides to every story. But so psychology, as Joe and Dorsa were saying, is extremely rigorous. Well, yeah.
Don't overdo it, Clark.
They've had some. I don't want to overdo it. But I mean, that's their brand. That's their brand, is measurement, being precise about measurement. The reason that psychology has corrected course, or is trying to correct course with the replication crisis and those things, is precisely because once it was brought to their attention, they immediately recognized that this was a problem for the field. So that's all good. And then anthropologists are more like herding cats. I mean, so if you're in a psych department, you find that everyone shares not everyone, but there's a much greater consensus of worldview, agreement. This is how we should measure things. This is the proper way to do an experiment. Of course, there's diversity and difference of opinion there, but compared to anthropology, psychology is way more homogeneous in that way. It's been my experience. And then anthropologists, you can't get, I mean, there's 5 of us here. Maybe we're agreeing on some stuff, but the typical case is you get 5 anthropologists in a room and they're not going to agree about the best way to do things. And that's, in a way, to a psychologist, that might seem like a disadvantage of anthropology, but as an anthropologist, I actually find that to be the virtue of anthropology. In a certain sense, it can impede progress because there can be just disagreement about really fundamental things, but at the same time, it has that diversity which drives knowledge forward, because not everybody's doing the same thing or looking at the same phenomena in the same way. So that's by way of answering, I think your question, Corinne, was advice for the younger generation about how to get into field work and things like that. I mean, the one sort of maybe dirty little secret of anthropology also is, if you ask anthropologists, how did you get to your field site? How did you start working with the people that you do? I really haven't met anybody, maybe some of us here can disagree, who said, well, I thought this place would be the ideal place to go to test something, to test some hypothesis. Maybe, but I think that there's a lot more accident involved. There's something to be said for being systematic about it, but I think there's also something to be said for, picking a place based on all kinds of reasons, even just sort of random reasons, and getting to know it. But what all anthropologists would tell you is that you really should immerse yourself in the place that you work. And so a risk of people participating in these 10, 20, 30 culture studies, like Dorsa is saying, it's true that in those cases, a lot of times there's someone, an ethnographer on the ground in each of those places who has rich familiarity. But I think that sometimes we have students now who are getting educated, who basically design some protocol and then send it to a network of people where it's run by a bunch of other people. And then they miss, even though there's cross-cultural element in their work, they miss the true ethnographic experience, which everyone here will tell you. There are things that you realize, there are things that you learn, there are things that you learn about humans and life and yourself that cannot be learned any other way. And so that's what I would encourage people to do. And just accept that some of it is maybe accidental, and you get where you end up through a random walk through the world.
I'll just say it was funny that you mentioned the disagreement between anthropologists. One of the I'm reminded of one of Joe's presentations on sort of how to conduct a cross-cultural, how to get real-in researchers to do cross-cultural research. And I think, Joe, you talked about rogue anthropologists, how they just kind of they either go missing or they just do their own thing, and they how it can be difficult.
They'll change the method midway through doing it. I thought this would work better.
Okay, I'm going to go to another question from the audience. We have one here from David Boss. It says, Coren's question about universality. I'm going to read it and process at the same time. How do panelists think about levels of abstraction? For example, status may be influenced by hunting skills in one culture, gathering skills in another, money in a third. So at one level, it looks like infinite cultural variability, but at a higher level, these are all modes of resource acquisition.
Well, the answer is you need a theory, right? What's the evolutionary process that brought the status into its place, and then what's the range of things that can be brought into that through cultural evolution?
Okay, it's sort of like I was saying before, right? I think there can be aspects of both, and the question. So if you can get to the root of what the theory is actually saying, then there may be, so we did this in the jealousy study, right? So just obviously David knows well, but there was one piece of that, which was this sex difference that we did find across 11 different places, but we, and that was interesting, right? I mean, to replicate, but I mean, we were not the first to replicate that result. To me, what was more interesting was trying to unpack what was going on behind the scenes a little bit more. And that meant looking at variation. And so again, we went back to theory and said, well, what might matter here is something like the level of paternal investment, right? That might affect the ways that people feel about jealousy. So you still have this layer of the universal sex difference underneath this, but then on top of it, you've got all sorts of other things, whether they're cultural or ecological or whatever kinds of pressures coming in, and that impacts the way that same sex difference is going to play out in different places. So when you're thinking about the actual behavior, it's going to look quite variable because of that. And but there's still theory, and I think that as Joe is saying, you can layer different kinds of theory and things like that, but I think that should help us to see the kind of interplay between.
That's great.
So just to follow up on David's status question, so I developed this theory of status based on prestige and dominance in 2001, and that paper makes a whole series of predictions, and we expect those to govern prestige across diverse societies. Now, other people may have different ideas, and it's fine to let those compete. But that's a case where we can still make lots of predictions about what you expect across societies, having a theory of status, even though it's hunting in one place, getting heads in another place, and having a big car in a third place.
How about frameworks? That's something that you've talked about, Joe, in a recent paper, that we just need more overarching frameworks from which to understand human behavior. And in particular, you argued or advocated strongly for gene culture coevolutionary theory as this organizing framework for understanding humans. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because I'm reading your book right now. I'll also, congratulations, by the way.
Good.
And I'll just say it has a dual purpose here at home. I'm using it also as and there are shortage of fitness equipment. I'm using it as a weight too. It's pretty big, pretty heavy. But in that book, you have all these really cool examples of how culture affects biology, but independent of genes. It does. So you talk about reading, you talk about monogamous marriage as well. And so I'm just wondering, why prioritize gene culture coevolutionary sort of that framework when you have culture just acting on biology, and those things are really interesting too.
Right. Yeah. So just on the note, it's mostly references and endnotes, so it's really it's a light read. Lots of pictures too. Yeah, so in the book, I make the case that in order to build theories that explain cultural variation, we need to take seriously the idea that one of the things about the genetic evolution of human brains is that we've evolved to be responsive to the constraints imposed by technology, the affordances imposed by technology, institutions, and languages, which means then we need a theory of where institutions come from, a cultural evolutionary theory of where that comes from. So that takes us into needing a cultural evolutionary theory, but to understand institutions, say, you also need to take seriously our evolved psychology. And that includes things traditionally under the frame of evolved psychology. But I also want to include lots of features of social psychology, like our psychology of norms, our norm psychology, that are products of gene-culture coevolution. So, of course, we know that lots of our physiology and anatomy has been shaped by culture. So the effect of fire and cooking on our colons or our stomachs is one example. So in order to have a full theory that can explain cultural variation with institutions, that takes seriously both our evolved psychology and our co-evolutionary psychology, you need a broader framework like gene culture co-evolution. And for that, you can look at my 2016 book, The Secret of Our Success.
Any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Clark. Were you gonna, I see your hand moving, so I don't want to interrupt anybody.
I wanted to know what Dorsa thought about it.
Well, about competing frameworks. I mean, I will say, like, it really depends on the question that you're asking and the framework that's best suited to that question. There are obviously going to be long-reaching consequences for something like gene culture coevolution. But there are lots of frameworks for understanding things in different contexts or different questions that require other frameworks. Like, I think it's hard to have like one big framework for understanding all of human behavior, right? And I will just say, like, just to defend psychology a little bit, which has kind of become my second home, I think that the popular conception of psychology is like social psychology, and of that, probably like the ones that are more like pop psychology. But psychology is a really diverse field, and especially the fields of the interdisciplinary field, in fact, of cognitive science, is a very, very richly theoretical field with a very long history and a lot of frameworks that have been, I think, very, very important for understanding and predicting human behavior. And I think the types of questions you might ask, for instance, in vision science and perception might come from a slightly different framework, depending on the level of the question that you're asking and what the goal of the research is. So I don't know if that answers Clark's question about the question.
That's a great point. I would add, Joe had made a plug for human evolutionary biology at Harvard as a good model for a department. I would also add a great model for a department is the cognitive science department at Central European University, where it's a true cognitive science department in the sense that there were 6 or 7 fields envisioned to be part of cognitive science. So they have anthropologists, they have psychologists, they have philosophers, all in the same department. And I think there are not many departments like that in the country or the world. But that's a good model too.
I guess I want to push back. I would say that if you want to do vision science seriously, you have to recognize that our ontogenetic system adapts to the visual environment it encounters. My example is the Mueller-Lyer illusion. Then you need a theory of how the visual environment is culturally constructed. Carpentered corners, technology, computers, all alters our visual system. So you got to get a bigger framework.
I will say, I could go on and on about the Mueller-Lyer, but I did spend a lot of time in Brian Scholl's lab at Yale. And I think there actually is quite a lot of work out there that suggests maybe that the original work that you're referencing, Joe, I think it's Siegel or Campbell from like the 1960s or 70s, may not necessarily hold up, I think, under the methodological rigor of modern science.
Well,
for instance, yeah.
But so, I mean, is the claim, the more general claim you think is wrong? So that was just one example that I thought people would be familiar with. I mean, there's lots of experiments with all kinds of animals showing you can modify their visual perception by putting them in different environments. I mean, this is pretty solid findings, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, I really think okay, I'll use a better example. I can, just to add the Mueller-Lyer case though, so there's, for instance, cases where you have congenitally blind people and you, for instance, as a result of cataracts, and you remove the cataracts and they literally within 1 second look at the Mueller-Lyer and you're able to see it. That's maybe a separate discussion, but to say, so for instance, this question of whether, gene culture coevolution or evolutionary theory is necessary to answer all questions, it depends on the question, right? So if we have a question that pertains to the ultimate level, that's a really powerful framework. If you're interested in how our visual system processes, different colors and the neurophysiology of that, that's a slightly different question. Maybe you don't need to invoke these broader ultimate frameworks to come up with research questions at that level.
Yeah, I guess it depends if you want to create a vertically integrated system.
Most relevant for generating questions is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, I think it's a good time to go to an audience question. So we'll go to the top one here. Practically, do the panelists have suggestions for how groups like HBES can help to advance cross-cultural work for researchers who do not necessarily come from such traditions, psychologists, and do not have established logistics that many anthropologists do?
So we had a conference wrestling with a lot of these issues out at MPI in Leipzig. Almost, I guess, a year and a half or 2 years ago. And there was a lot of debate about, so one answer to this is what someone referenced earlier, that you rely on people who already have long-term field sites and write to them and ask them to run your study, right? And that's how you can get up to the magic 15. The people in the room at that workshop were all people who were running those long-term field sites. And, it puts a lot of pressure on those people who have put a lot of time and effort into developing their own research projects, and as well as all the relationships and logistics and everything that go into play to maintaining that work for a long time. And so on the one hand, I don't have a perfect answer to this, but I think on the one hand, there's the idea that, okay, well, instead of me going out and immersing myself and all the value that we sort of attached to that when we talked about that earlier, I can lean on, I want that ethnographic expertise to be included in my work. If I can't be all things to all people, then maybe I should ask somebody who already has that background to run this study for me. I think that's a valuable idea, right? And I think tries to incorporate a lot of what we've talked about. The problem is it puts a lot of pressure on those few people to be running a bunch of things that they may not be particularly invested in, and that, they're, for someone like me who has small kids, right, my time in the field is really limited. And so running other people's cross-cultural projects is not really top of my to-do list. So there's that idea versus trying to go in and do it yourself. So I don't, as I said, I don't have a great solution to this, but I think we need to at least be cognizant of what the costs and benefits of these different options are.
And a lot of, pressure on the population as well. That's going to have to do all these studies as well. On the practical side, I guess, from my perspective or experience, I've participated in some of these and ran, these studies on the ground with the Hadza, and they've helped supplement sort of my my costs for going to the field, right? So I'll get, some money from a researcher who's like, okay, well, you can have this money to run this. And that's a big help for, for anthropologists who maybe don't have as much money as the psychologists or economists, especially.
Or people who are doing dissertation work too, if they're there for an entire year. Right? Like when I go for 3 weeks to run and somebody says, it's only going to take X number of hours to run this with, 50 people or 100 people, that's relatively a big chunk. But if you're out there, if it's somebody who's out there for a year, then taking a week to run your study is going to be a lot less costly to them.
I just add one additional thing to think about for students and others who are thinking about getting into this. And this is what, putting on my cultural anthropologist hat, ask yourself, do you need to go to Africa? Do you need to go to South America? Do you need to go to China? If you do, or if there's a reason to do that, great. But I really think that, there's a lot of research that we could do using our own, what's nearby us, whether it's geographically near or socially near. This is something that sociocultural anthropologists do all the time. And I think it's worth us thinking about that as HBES. Like if we want to study politics, if you're interested in prestige, if you're interested in status, I mean, I can go out in the street right here and study that. It's still a point to get away from studying college students because they're college students.
And MTurk.
And MTurk, I completely agree with that. It's, these are convenient samples, but we could, this is what I mean. This is what we mean when we're talking about these sort of middle populations that aren't
right.
brought into the real world around you, because evolutionary psychology is happening everywhere. And so if you want to work in a difficult to access place, or a place that's culturally very different than what you're familiar with, that's cool. And I do hope that HBES can help people do that by forging connections between researchers who want to go to those places.
Well, Brooke, what would you say to that? Because you, in a recent Proc B paper that you and co-authors published talking about, ethical considerations to the cross-cultural research, and this is something I've heard Clark argue too, that, we should be primarily choosing our samples based on theoretically grounded predictions about how we expect behavior to show up in different places, right? And one of the reasons why this is good from an ethical perspective is because it minimizes, exoticizing these populations, right? Not just choosing them because they're so different. But as we talked about already, I'm sure there's attendees here who, aren't necessarily interested in, the differences among us, but those traits that are panhuman. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk about, exoticism on the one side, but also how, in this quest to understand panhuman traits, do you make an exception for choosing societies that are then, more different, maximally different? What are the exceptions, or is that type of research just harmful?
Well, I mean, I think it really depends on what your question is, right? I mean, I guess the harmful piece, I guess sometimes if people are just looking at trying to go and do work in some small scale society because they're trying to get back to our evolutionary roots, right? There, I see harm in doing that in a way that's not nuanced and thinking about how representative that group actually is of our past, and so so sometimes I think, going down the street is the right thing to do. If you think you can find it anywhere, you should be able to find it down the street just as likely as you should be to be able to find it with Himba or Hadza or somebody like that, right? So it depends a lot on the question. Maybe I'm not getting at your larger question about harm, but I'm watching a side conversation happening in the chat, so I can't help myself. I'm sorry, but there's an important thread that's coming in there that I think, in terms of thinking about how to be integrative and think about these different perspectives, which is also just thinking about how to include researchers and scientists from other places as well, right? And I think we are a little bit more, there was a comment about global health in the chat, but I think we're a little bit more handicapped in that most, even psychology, anthropology departments where they exist in low and middle income countries, and there isn't an anthropology department yet in Namibia, but they're working on starting one, is that people are less likely to be trained in evolutionary social sciences, right? And so finding collaborators who might want to partner with you to do this kind of work might be harder in some places than others. For me, my workaround has been to try to still look for collaborators and have a dovetailing of interest, right? The topics that I'm interested in, I may be looking at it from one perspective and they may be interested in it from another, but we're still really, interested in behavior or health or, cultural practices or things like that. And so I think there are ways to still be able to work collaboratively and build research design that integrates both those perspectives and also gets people involved from the countries that you're working in. And that's another, I mean, thinking about from the issue, thinking about students, but thinking also about sort of building up your research design as a junior person who's getting things started. I think nowadays that should be part of what you're thinking about from the beginning.
That's great. I take
one point to be that it would be good if there were more people who develop long-term field sites. It seems like we're short on those and long on people that don't do that. And there's no shortage of people in the world, as Clark likes to point out.
And just to kind of follow up, so, Brooke and her collaborators wrote this really great paper on the ethical considerations of cross-cultural work. And one thing that I worry about a bit as cross-cultural work becomes more and more mainstream and valued is that a lot of people are going to start doing it because it's trendy, for instance. And you're going to get this influx of researchers who really aren't well trained to deal, especially with vulnerable populations, in ways that minimize harm and impact. So I think the lesson is not that everyone needs to do cross-cultural work, but that there is, I think, more value in cross-cultural work than previously attributed. And that work should be funded and kind of rewarded and followed up on, but not necessarily that like everyone needs to have a cross-cultural paper on their CV.
I'll just say that's actually wonderful. I was going to just say that was a really nice way to wrap up the discussion. Really great points. Clark, did you want to add something else?
Oh, just briefly, Dorsa brings up the ethical issue of working across cultures. So, I mean, I think, which I think is massively important, and I think is something that people in evolutionary social science, including me, when I was entering the field, don't get enough training about that. So IRB teaches you stuff about ethics of research design, usually oriented towards like lab type research. I mean, they do deal with field stuff, but if you used IRB as the ethical gatekeeper to your work, you would be making a huge mistake because their bar is way too low for the ethics for cross-cultural research. And so going back to where to choose to work, I think that there's a trade-off where, it is useful. Some of us have worked in cultures that are quite different than our own, and that's an eye-opening experience and extremely valuable. But with it comes other kinds of ethical considerations about how you represent the people that you work with, whether you can or should speak for them in some way. Most cultural anthropologists would say you shouldn't, and including their point of view and making them full collaborators in your research. The thing that we've been talking about, studying closer to home, the advantage of that is that you come into that already having more familiarity with the community. And maybe your ethical stance vis-a-vis the community is going to be slightly less complicated as well, which is a bonus. And someone in the chat pointed out, which I absolutely agree with, that in many other countries, the standard kind of research is to do research near you, like geographically and socially adjacent to where you are. And one advantage to increasing the representativeness of researchers in HBES is that people who are from a particular country can do the work in that country, and we can approach them and ask them to do that work. People who are from a particular community can do that. Then it becomes also a question of us as science, as the structure of science, supporting education and training of people from underrepresented communities. That can be a solution as well. So we shouldn't just be thinking of this as, how do I get to go myself to all these unusual places, but to actually bring people from those places into the research community. I mean, both are valid, but we should really be thinking, we don't think enough about that other mode of research.
Right. Well, maybe we will be now, just because, that this pandemic is, keeping us at home. But, I am mindful of the time we've gone over. It's just been such a wonderful discussion. And again, I just thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I learned a lot. I've got a lot to think about. I hope that we just keep this dialogue going in the future. So
thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to you all. Thanks, Coren and Chris, for organizing this.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And bye to all the HBESers out there. Thanks for joining.
Is it possible to save the chat so that we can see what was in it?
I would like to. I'm going to ask Chris to turn off his mic because I don't think or turn on his mic. I don't think he knows that he's muted, but he was talking. But yeah, it would be great if we could save the video well, I think the video is going to get saved, but the chat and the questions, because we didn't get up to all the questions and I really want to see them all.
They were scrolling through pretty quickly and I didn't see them all, so it'd be really nice to know.
Every time I opened up the questions, you disappeared. And so it was just hard to keep track of both. But this is a skill that we're going to have to develop with time.
I do believe the chat is recorded as well. I just wanted to thank you guys so much for this wonderful conversation, and thank you HBES members and the audience for your participation. A big thank you to the Executive Council again for supporting and helping to organize this series. And I just wanted to give a quick plug for our next event, which will be November 17th at 12 p.m. Eastern time, and will be on life history theory as applied to individual variation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.